Hello boys and girls, and welcome back to story part 3 with me. I hope you're all sitting very comfortably, and I hope you've all been enjoying all the stories that I have been reading. I have been very excited to entertain you while you're at home, and I hope you've been doing lots of exciting things with your family. But for now, shall we read you another story? I thought we might do something that needs the colour red, and there's a big bad wolf. We're going to be reading the Little Red Riding Hood. Now, Little Red Riding Hood is one of my very good friends, and she's very excited that I'm reading the story to you today. Are we ready? Here we go. Once upon a time, there was a girl called Little Red Riding Hood who lived at the edge of the big dark forest. Little Red Riding Hood had a grandmother who lived on her own in a cottage on the other side of the forest. One morning, Little Red Riding Hood set off to visit her grandmother for lunch, like she did every week. Little Red Riding Hood skipped along the path through the forest, but soon became tired and stopped to rest under a tree. As she closed her eyes, Little Red Riding Hood heard a voice from behind the tree. "Hello, little girl. Are you lost?" "I'm not lost. I'm going to visit my grandmother, who lives in the cottage on the other side of the forest," Little Red Riding Hood replied. What Little Red Riding Hood didn't know was that she was talking to the big bad wolf. Little Red Riding Hood didn't know that the big bad wolf wanted to gobble her up right then, but he decided he would race ahead to her grandmother's cottage so he could gobble both of them up for lunch. The wolf ran ahead until he reached Little Red Riding Hood's grandmother's cottage. He knocked on the door. "Who's there?" cried a voice from inside. "It's me, Little Red Riding Hood," replied the wolf. The wolf opened the door, and before Little Red Riding Hood's grandmother could even scream, he gobbled her right up. Quickly, the wolf put on her nightcap and glasses and tucked himself into bed. When Little Red Riding Hood reached her grandmother's cottage, she knocked on the door and called out, "Grandmother, it's me, Little Red Riding Hood." "Come in," said a voice from inside the cottage. So Little Red Riding Hood opened the door and went inside. Little Red Riding Hood thought that her grandmother looked very strange, so she switched on the lamp. "Grandmother, what big eyes you have!" exclaimed Little Red Riding Hood. "All the better to see you with, my dear," replied the wolf. Oh dear, boys and girls, do you know what the wolf's going to do? Little Red Riding Hood crept a little closer. "Grandmother, what big ears you have!" gasped Little Red Riding Hood. "All the better to hear you with, my dear," replied the wolf. Little Red Riding Hood crept right up close to the bed. "Grandmother, what big teeth you have!" cried Little Red Riding Hood, as the light glinted off the wolf's teeth. All the better to eat you with, shouted the wolf, leaping out of bed. Ah! Cried Little Red Riding Hood, swung her basket into the air and started to run. The basket was very heavy. It knocked the wolf right over. Just then, the door swung open. Little Red Riding Hood's father arrived on the way home from chopping some wood. Little Red Riding Hood told her father all about the big bad wolf and how he had eaten the grandmother and tried to eat her too. Little Red Riding Hood's father took his enormous axe and carefully slit the wolf's tummy open. And out popped Little Red Riding Hood's grandmother. Little Red Riding Hood's grandmother was very happy to be back, as she agreed to come for tea at Little Red Riding House. Little Red Riding Hood and her grandmother and father walked out of the cottage and closed the door behind them. Good riddance to the big bad wolf, said Little Red Riding Hood. And from that day, the wolf never bothered Little Red Riding Hood or grandmother ever again. Thank you again very, very much for reading fairy tales with myself, and I hope you will come back soon and see me again. But for now, until another bedtime story, good night and sleep tight.